My name is Sabrina Matthews. I'm 42. And when I found the hidden app on my phone at 2:45 a.m., I thought it was just my husband spying. What I didn't know was that it wasn't just him. It was his law firm, his affair partner, his plan to erase me and take full custody of our daughter. But he forgot one thing. Our daughter is a coder. And together, we tore his empire apart. Before I tell you everything, tell me, where are you listening from right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. The alert didn't look like much. Just a notification from something called SecureTrack Pro. It popped up on my screen, a small, innocuous badge that seemed to glow in the darkness of our bedroom. My hand had been reaching for my water glass, half asleep, and the sudden light from the phone startled me. Paul was breathing softly beside me, the steady rhythm of his sleep a stark contrast to the sudden, frantic beat of my own heart. I squinted, the digital clock on the nightstand flashing 2:45 a.m. Too early for an email, too late for a text. Curiosity, that insidious little worm, burrowed into my groggy mind. I tapped it. What unfolded on the screen was a grotesque, digital map of my life. My location history, a dotted line tracing every school drop-off, every grocery run, every coffee shop where I'd met a friend. It wasn't just where I'd been, it was how long I'd lingered, what routes I took. Then, audio recordings. A chilling list of timestamps, each one a silent accusation. My voice, hushed, confiding in my best friend, Sarah, about my growing unease with Paul's late nights. Sarah's empathetic sighs. The clinking of our mugs. It was all there, laid bare. Search history. My attempts to understand Paul's distant behavior, articles on marital strain, on communication breakdowns. And then, the ultimate violation, a short video clip. Me, laughing with Alyssa in the kitchen as we baked cookies, flour dusting our noses. Harmless, joyful. But seeing it, knowing it was being recorded, harvested, cataloged, it was like watching a ghost of myself, a life being secretly documented for unknown purposes. I wasn't paranoid anymore. The whispers of doubt that had plagued me for months coalesced into a terrifying, undeniable truth. I wasn't imagining things, wasn't being overly sensitive. I was a target. And the person who had installed it, the architect of this digital cage, was sleeping right beside me, his breathing still shallow and even, a picture of serene innocence. The air in the room, which had always felt safe and familiar, suddenly felt thick, suffocating. My throat constricted, and a cold dread seeped into my bones, a kind of primal terror that chills you from the inside out. My illusion of safety, of partnership, shattered into a million sharp, invisible pieces. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. Just lay there, the screen glowing, the truth searing itself into my mind. Paul used to be my world. Not just a world, but the world around which my own revolved. A gravitational pull so strong I barely noticed I was orbiting him. We built our life from scratch, brick by brick, dream by dream. I remembered the scent of sawdust and fresh paint from our first apartment, small, but filled with the boundless optimism of youth. I supported him through law school, working full-time as a high school English teacher, grading papers by the dim light of a desk lamp long after he'd fallen asleep over his torts textbooks. My own dreams of a master's degree, of writing a novel, they faded into the background, willingly, or so I told myself then. His success was our success, wasn't it? His ambition, our shared ambition. He'd bring home late-night coffee, a half-eaten pizza, and we'd sit on the floor, mapping out our future, the house with the big yard, the travel, the family. Simple, tangible dreams. I gave up promotions to raise our daughter, Alyssa. The head of the English department position came up twice, a role I'd secretly coveted, a chance to shape curriculum, to lead. But each time, Paul would gently, logically explain. Sabrina, with your salary and my burgeoning career, it makes more sense for you to be home more, especially with Alyssa so young. And it did make sense on paper. His career was on an exponential upward curve, mine a steady, respectable line. So I embraced the bake sales, the school plays, the parent-teacher conferences, the quiet joy of being present for every scraped knee and every triumphant discovery. Alyssa thrived, a bright, curious child, and I believed I was giving her the greatest gift, my time, my unwavering presence. Paul always said I was the rock. The unwavering foundation, the stable core, the one who held everything together. He'd say it with a certain wistful admiration, a hand on my shoulder, making me feel essential, indispensable. But rocks get stepped on, don't they? And slowly, imperceptibly at first, that's what happened. The admiration in his eyes seemed to dim, replaced by something colder, more transactional. The late nights at the office became more frequent, his explanations more vague, his answers clipped. Big case, honey. You wouldn't understand the intricacies. I stopped asking. Our conversations, once meandering and intimate, became practical updates, school schedules, household repairs, bills. The easy laughter, the shared glances across a crowded room, the spontaneous touches, they all evaporated, replaced by a polite distance. When I tried to bridge it, he'd seem distracted, his eyes already drifting towards his phone, or the television, or simply a space beyond me. I blamed myself. Of course I did. I scoured self-help articles online, wondering if I was nagging too much, if I was no longer interesting, if the years of domesticity had rendered me invisible. I tried new recipes, bought new clothes, even suggested a weekend getaway that he promptly dismissed as unfeasible due to his demanding schedule. I told myself marriage was hard, that all couples went through phases, that this was just a particularly long, particularly cold winter. I clung to the memories of the old Paul, the one who would surprise me with flowers, the one who saw me, truly saw me. I built a fortress of rationalizations around my heart, trying to protect it from the creeping tendrils of doubt. Until that app showed me the truth. It wasn't about me. It was about control. It wasn't about a phase, it was about an agenda. He'd been erasing me, one spyware update at a time. Systematically dismantling my privacy, my autonomy, my very sense of reality. The quiet erosion of our intimacy, the growing distance, it wasn't an emotional disconnect, but a calculated strategy. A deliberate, malicious act designed to make me feel small, unstable, and ultimately powerless. The realization was a punch to the gut, stealing the breath from my lungs. The man I had loved, supported, built a life with, was not just betraying me, he was dissecting me, piece by piece, under a digital microscope. And the horror of it was not just the act itself, but the chilling realization that he had been doing it all along, while I was so busy trying to fix us, trying to be the rock he needed. The rock was cracking, and it was his hammer that was doing the work. The seeds of unease had been planted long before I found the app, subtle little shifts, like a house settling or a foundation cracking, the sounds too faint to register as true alarm. I just hadn't known how to interpret them. Paul had started keeping his phone locked, not just with a passcode, but with biometrics, something he'd always scoffed at as overkill. "Who's going to hack my grocery list, Sabrina?" he joked once, long ago. Now his phone was practically glued to his hand, always face down on tables, carried with him even to the bathroom. If I picked it up, even to check the time, he'd materialize, a shadow at my elbow, a quick, terse question, looking for something. His eyes, normally warm, would be momentarily sharp, almost predatory. I'd shrug, mumbling an excuse, and hand it back, my heart doing a little flutter of unease. Then there were the odd silences. Dinner used to be a cacophony of sound, Alyssa's chatter about school, my anecdotes from teaching, Paul's stories from work. But lately, a heavy quiet had descended. Paul would stare at his plate, or at some point beyond my shoulder, lost in his own thoughts. If I asked about his day, he'd offer terse, non-committal answers. Fine. Busy. Nothing interesting. The casual intimacy of sharing the day's burdens and triumphs, a ritual we'd always cherished, had withered into obligation. Sometimes, he'd glance up, catch my eye, and a flicker of something unreadable, annoyance, guilt, would pass through his gaze before he'd quickly look away. I'd try to fill the void, talking more, asking Alyssa more questions, but the silence felt like a tangible presence, pressing down on us, an invisible wedge between us. My gut feelings, once a reliable compass, spun wildly. I'd wake in the middle of the night, a knot of anxiety in my stomach, unable to pinpoint its source. I'd lie there, listening to Paul's steady breathing, trying to rationalize away the dread. It's stress. He's under pressure at work. All couples go through periods of quiet. But the feelings persisted, a low hum beneath the surface of my everyday life. One evening, Paul received a text and his phone buzzed on the counter. He was in the shower. I saw the preview. Can't wait to see you tonight. Erica. My blood ran cold. Erica? I didn't know an Erica. My finger hovered over the screen, tempted to open the message, to confirm my darkest fears. But then Paul called out from the bathroom, his voice booming slightly. Honey, can you grab me a towel? I jumped, my hand recoiling as if burned. I quickly placed the phone face down, heart hammering, and rushed to get the towel. When he emerged, wrapped in white terry cloth, he glanced at his phone, then at me, his eyes narrowed slightly. Everything okay? He asked, a hint of suspicion in his voice. Fine, I managed, my voice a little too high. The moment passed, but the seed of suspicion had been firmly planted, watered by my own fear and his subtle scrutiny. He started forgetting things, or pretending to. Anniversaries, my birthday, plans we'd made weeks in advance. Little things at first. A promised dinner out, forgotten. A casual mention of a movie we'd wanted to see, met with a blank stare. Then larger things. Alyssa's school concert, something he'd always made a point of attending, was suddenly slipped his mind because of an urgent meeting. The casual disregard felt like a deliberate erasure, a subtle message that I, and our life together, were becoming less important, less worthy of his memory. He'd offer perfunctory apologies, brief and hollow, already turning to something else. And I, desperate to cling to the illusion of our shared life, would accept them, trying to believe he was simply overwhelmed, stressed. The tension was a constant companion, a taut string vibrating just beneath the surface of our lives. I felt like I was walking on eggshells, constantly trying to predict his moods, to avoid upsetting him, to prevent the sudden, inexplicable silences. The house, once filled with the warmth of family, felt increasingly cold, permeated by an unspoken dread. I started to question my own perception, my own sanity. Was I imagining things? Was I overreacting? His increasing gaslighting tactics, "You're being dramatic, Sabrina. Why do you always jump to conclusions?" That never happened. You must be remembering it wrong, chipped away at my confidence, making me doubt my own memories, my own gut. The audience should start to feel the confusion and dread without full clarity yet, just as I did. It was a slow, agonizing slide into a fog of uncertainty, where every interaction felt like a test, every silence a judgment. And all the while, the spyware was diligently recording, collecting evidence, building a case against me, without my knowledge, turning my own life into a weapon to be used against me. The dread was a physical weight, pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe, making me wonder if I was truly losing my mind, or if something far more sinister was at play. The truth, when it finally revealed itself in the cold, digital glow of my phone, wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a silent, devastating implosion. It wasn't the sound of screaming, but the sound of my own internal world crumbling. The screen, with its chilling display of my monitored life, felt impossibly heavy in my hand, as if it weighed 100 pounds. The notification from Secure Track Pro, no longer innocuous, was a malevolent eye staring back at me, reflecting my own horror. I scrolled through the recorded audio, the location pings, the browser history. Each data point was a pinprick, then a stab, then a gaping wound. I remember my breath catching in my throat, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to echo in the cavernous silence of the bedroom. Paul's steady breathing next to me, so calm, so innocent, was a grotesque mockery. I wanted to scream, to shake him awake, to demand answers, to tear the placid mask from his face. But I couldn't. My body felt frozen, paralyzed by a shock so profound it rendered me utterly still. The anger, the hurt, the betrayal, they were too immense, too overwhelming to be contained by a mere scream. Instead, a wave of profound, bone-deep silence washed over me, a silence that muffled every sound, every thought, every emotion. It was the silence of absolute desolation. The world I trusted, the bedrock of my existence, my marriage, my home, my husband's supposed love, no longer existed. It was a carefully constructed illusion, a cruel mirage. And I, the trusting fool, had walked willingly into it. The pain wasn't a sharp, acute pang. It was a vast, crushing weight, as if every ounce of love, trust, and hope I had invested had been returned to me as lead, filling every cavity of my being. My vision blurred, but no tears came. My body felt leaden, heavy, pinned to the bed by the sheer force of this realization. It was a visceral understanding, a total absorption of the horror. My mind replayed countless moments, his late nights, the averted glances, the guarded phone, the strange silences. Each memory, once benign, now twisted into something sinister, a piece of a puzzle I had been too blind, too trusting, to see. He hadn't just been distant. He had been calculating. He hadn't just been busy. He had been building a secret life, a secret strategy. The emotional collapse wasn't a dramatic fall. It was a quiet implosion. It was the realization that I was utterly alone, adrift in a sea of his deceit. The man I had shared my life with, the father of my child, was a stranger. Worse, he was an enemy cloaked in the guise of a husband. The intimacy we once shared felt like a violation. Every touch, every whispered word, every shared secret now tainted by the knowledge that I was being analyzed, catalogued, spied upon. It wasn't just a betrayal of trust, it was a betrayal of my very self, my right to privacy, my dignity. I lay there for what felt like hours, the phone still clutched in my hand, its cold glass a stark reality against my clammy palm. The darkness of the room seemed to press in, amplifying my internal turmoil. I wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the mattress, to cease to exist. The shock had bypassed my mind and settled deep in my gut, a sick, churning sensation that made me want to vomit. The familiar scent of our bedroom, Paul's cologne, the faint lingering of my lavender laundry detergent, now felt foreign, tainted. It was like living in a house that suddenly, terrifyingly, revealed itself to be someone else's, a stranger's, and you were just a captive audience to their sinister plans. This was not my home. This was not my life. This was a stage for his manipulation, and I was the unwitting performer. The silence stretched, vast and empty, filled only with the deafening roar of my own shattered heart. The shift in tone began not with a bang, but with a barely perceptible click. It was the click of something deep inside me, a long-dormant mechanism, settling into place. The shock and the despair didn't vanish, not entirely, but they began to recede, making way for a cold, clear space. In the hours after the shattering moment, lying beside Paul's placid form, the anger simmered, but it was a quiet, controlled heat, not a raging fire. There was no room for yelling, no energy for histrionics. That would have been too easy, too familiar, too much like the old Sabrina. This was different. This was about survival, about reclaiming something that had been stolen. I began to observe. Not with the frantic, paranoid gaze of someone looking for reassurance, but with the steady, calculating eye of a strategist. Every morning, Paul's routine was under my silent scrutiny. The way he meticulously straightened his tie, the casual kiss he'd pressed to my forehead, a kiss that now felt like a brand, the way his eyes would flick to his phone before he left. I noted the precise time he left for work, the seemingly random excuses for his late returns. I started paying attention to his phone calls, the lowered voice, the quick hang-ups when I entered the room. Every detail, no matter how small, was a potential piece of the puzzle. I wasn't just observing him, I was observing our life, the one he had tried to dismantle, looking for the cracks, the weak points, the hidden levers. My phone, the instrument of my discovery, became my quiet weapon. Instead of succumbing to panic, I began to study SecureTrack Pro. I didn't delete it. I didn't confront him. That would be too soon, too predictable. I learned its features, its limitations, its vulnerabilities. It was a chilling education, a crash course in digital espionage. I discovered how it uploaded data, how it communicated, how easily it could be manipulated from the outside. I started taking screenshots, time-stamped, of every new data upload, every recorded conversation. I created a hidden folder, encrypted and password protected, a digital vault for the proof he was so meticulously collecting against me. Each piece of evidence I gathered was a small brick, rebuilding my inner strength. The silence between Paul and me intensified, but now it was a chosen silence on my part, not a forced one. When he'd make a dismissive comment or offer a half-hearted apology, I'd just nod, a small, inscrutable smile playing on my lips. He seemed to interpret my quietness as resignation, as me internalizing his gaslighting. He didn't know it was the quiet of a hunter, of someone meticulously charting a course of action. It was the quiet of someone who was no longer reacting, but planning. I started rebuilding from within, piece by painful piece. The first step was recognizing the insidious nature of his betrayal. It wasn't just about the affair or the spying. It was about power, control, and erasure. He wanted to erase me from the narrative of my own life. But understanding that gave me a new kind of clarity. My strength wasn't going to come from external validation or from trying to fix him. It was going to come from within, from acknowledging my own worth, from reclaiming my agency. I started journaling again, something I'd abandoned years ago. Not emotional outpourings, but crisp, concise observations, facts, feelings. It was a way to ground myself in reality, to combat the gaslighting, to solidify my own narrative. Each entry was a step towards reclaiming my truth, tracking the subtle shifts in Paul's behavior, the emerging patterns of his deceit. It was the seed of a transformation, small and hidden, but potent. I was no longer the rock that gets stepped on. I was the rock that holds the hidden diamonds. The turn, when it finally arrived, wasn't a climactic explosion in a courtroom, not yet. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in power dynamics within our own home, a quiet, dignified act that caught Paul completely off guard. He was so accustomed to my passive resignation, to my quiet acceptance of his diminishing presence, that he simply didn't see it coming. It started with Tony Stark. Not Iron Man, no, but a private investigator, a former detective I'd known tangentially through a friend years ago. Tony was known for his discretion, his meticulous methods, and a certain grim, unwavering dedication to the truth. I had texted him from a burner phone I'd bought with cash, a quiet act of rebellion. Need to talk. Discreetly. About something serious. His reply was immediate. Coffee shop, 6 a.m., downtown. Come alone. The next morning, as Paul snored softly, I slipped out of the house, a sense of cold, purposeful resolve guiding my steps. In the sterile, fluorescent light of the coffee shop, sipping lukewarm coffee, I laid out my story, calmly, methodically. I showed him the screenshots, the data logs, the ominous messages from unknown numbers. Tony listened, his expression unchanging, a deep furrow in his brow. When I finished, he simply nodded. Sabrina, this isn't just about a cheating husband. This is much bigger. His words, delivered in a low, gravelly voice, were both terrifying and validating. The public humiliation, the initial salvo in Paul's campaign to discredit me, had already begun. He reported me to the school board, alleging erratic behavior and unprofessional conduct, trying to paint me as unstable, paranoid. My principal, a kind but by-the-book woman, called me in for a meeting, her face etched with concern, but also a hint of suspicion. Sabrina, Mr. Matthews contacted us. He's concerned about your well-being. And frankly, some of the things he said. I let her talk, my face carefully neutral. Inside, a cold fury was building. This wasn't just about him leaving me. It was about destroying my career, my reputation, my ability to support myself and Alyssa. This was an attack on my very identity. But he underestimated me. And he drastically underestimated Alyssa. While Tony was quietly digging, following digital breadcrumbs and physical trails, Alyssa had already started her own, much more personal investigation. She was only 15, but she had a mind like a steel trap, a natural affinity for logic and systems. A coder in the making. She'd noticed Paul's laptop, always open, always minimized, but often forgotten. One afternoon, while Paul was out at a client meeting, Alyssa had casually sat at his desk, pretending to do her homework. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, a familiar melody of keystrokes. She wasn't hacking, not in the traditional sense. She was exploring. She found hidden folders, obscure file names. And then she found the emails. Not just one or two, but a sprawling, interconnected web of correspondence. Names. Dates. Photos. Passwords, often disguised as innocuous birthday reminders or anniversaries. The mistress, Erica, wasn't just a name. She was a face, a co-conspirator. But beyond Erica, there were other names, other code names, references to Project Chimera, Asset Zero, and cryptic financial figures. "You're not going to let him win, are you, Mom?" She asked me that one evening, her eyes, Paul's eyes, but filled with a fierce, protective fire that was all her own, burning into mine. She was holding a flash drive, small and unassuming, but packed with more truth than I could have imagined. I saw myself in her then, not the scared, hesitant version I'd become, but the younger me, the one who wasn't afraid to challenge, to fight for what was right. In that moment, our separate investigations converged. We were no longer afraid. We were building a case, not just for my freedom, but for our shared future. The balance of power had shifted, silently, definitively, from him to us. The hunter had become the hunted, and he was still blissfully unaware. Tony's discoveries were like peeling back layers of an onion, each one revealing something more rotten, more extensive, more horrifying than the last. He didn't just find Erica, he found the entire network. The spyware on my phone wasn't a one-off, a desperate act of a paranoid husband. It was a professional-grade tool, replicated across an entire legal ecosystem. This wasn't just Paul being a bad husband. This was Paul being a cog in a much larger, much darker machine. The spyware was linked to an entire legal network, a shadowy collective operating out of a prominent, seemingly reputable law firm, Sterling and Vance. They weren't just practicing law, they were weaponizing it. They tracked high-profile divorce clients, not to win cases fairly, but to gain leverage in settlements. Imagine a wealthy CEO going through a messy divorce, only to find their private conversations with their therapist, their secret rendezvous, their financial indiscretions, all laid bare. This wasn't about legal strategy, it was about digital blackmail. They laundered money through shell corporations, funneling illicit gains from these coerced settlements. They built fake audio files, stitching together innocuous snippets of conversation to create damning, fabricated evidence. They used deepfake technology to create convincing, yet utterly false, video confessions. This wasn't just a law firm, it was a criminal enterprise disguised as a pillar of justice. And Paul? My Paul, the man who prided himself on his integrity, his ethical standing, his unwavering commitment to justice? He wasn't just participating, he was a key player. He was their point man for digital surveillance, the architect of the traps, the one who oversaw the deployment of the spyware. His client meetings weren't just with clients, they were with co-conspirators, meticulously planning the digital dismantling of lives. He used his access, his knowledge, his position of trust to facilitate this elaborate web of deceit. The realization was a colder, sharper pain than the initial betrayal. It wasn't just that he had betrayed me, he had betrayed everything he claimed to stand for. He was a fraud, a hypocrite, a criminal hiding behind a polished suit and a prestigious title. Even Alyssa's college fund, the sacred trust we had built together, the future we had envisioned for her, had been used as a front. Tony found evidence that substantial sums, purportedly for her education, had been funneled through opaque accounts, eventually disappearing into the Sterling and Vance network. It was money laundering, plain and simple, using the innocent facade of a child's future to hide their ill-gotten gains. He was willing to ruin her future, to compromise her security, to erase her potential, all to secure his own position within this corrupt empire. That was the ultimate cut. Not just me, but our daughter. His own flesh and blood. The man I loved, the man I married, had not just fallen. He had descended into a moral abyss so deep I could no longer recognize him. The man I knew was dead, replaced by a ghost of greed and ambition. Erica, the mistress, wasn't just an affair partner. She was a junior associate at Sterling and Vance, caught in their web. Tony discovered that she, too, was being blackmailed. Her sister had a severe medical condition, and the firm was subtly threatening to cut off her sister's exorbitant medical care if Erica didn't comply with their demands. She wasn't a mastermind, she was another victim, trapped in their gilded cage. This revelation added another layer of complexity, another shade of gray to the black and white picture of my shattered world. It didn't excuse Paul's actions, but it showed the pervasive reach of the firm's corruption. This wasn't just about personal betrayal, it was about a systemic rot that had infected every corner of Paul's professional life, and, consequently, ours. The true twist was the sheer scale of the deception. It was bigger than just Paul. It was a hydra, and we had only just seen the first head. They tried to frame me first. The call from the school board was merely the opening salvo in Paul's orchestrated campaign to discredit me. He followed it up with calls to my friends, planting seeds of doubt, spinning tales of my fragile mental state, my increasing paranoia. He filed for an emergency temporary restraining order, citing my unstable behavior and alleging I was a danger to Alyssa. He presented manipulated evidence, out-of-context emails, snippets of conversations, all designed to paint me as erratic, unfit, unhinged. The goal was clear, to make me appear so irrational that no one would believe me when the truth inevitably came out. To isolate me, to silence me, to ensure I lost everything, including my daughter. But I walked in with evidence. Not just a gut feeling, not just vague accusations, but concrete, irrefutable proof. I had the recordings from SecureTrack Pro, the full, unedited versions that exposed the gaps and manipulations into snippets. I had the invoices from the Spyware company, clearly showing Paul's name and account number. I had the data logs meticulously downloaded from Paul's own systems, revealing the extent of his digital intrusions, not just on me, but on other targets of Sterling and Vance. And then, the ultimate unexpected weapon, a live stream of his own confession, sent to the FBI. This wasn't a grand, cinematic confrontation. It happened at a mediation meeting, mandated by the court for the restraining order hearing. Paul, Erica, their lawyers, my lawyer, and a judge. The room was sterile, cold, filled with tension. Paul sat opposite me, an expression of smug confidence on his face. He'd clearly rehearsed his performance. He started speaking, his voice calm, measured, listing my alleged instabilities, his eyes occasionally flickering to gauge my reaction. But my reaction wasn't what he expected. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just looked at him, a faint, almost imperceptible smile on my lips. My lawyer, a formidable woman named Clara, had discreetly handed me a small, unassuming device. When Paul started to spin his web of lies, I pressed a button. A faint, almost inaudible hum. On a large screen at the front of the room, which was ostensibly for presenting court documents, a new window flickered open. It was a secure live stream, a direct feed to the FBI cybercrime unit that Tony had painstakingly set up. And then, Paul's own voice, clear and chilling, filled the room. It wasn't a live feed of the current conversation. It was a pre-recorded confession, a compilation of audio Tony and Alyssa had meticulously stitched together from Paul's phone and laptop, from his unguarded moments, from his drunken ramblings to Erica, from calls to his co-conspirators. It detailed the spyware operation, the money laundering, the blackmail. It was his own words, condemning him. The change in Paul's face was instantaneous, a horrifying transformation from self-assured arrogance to raw, animalistic terror. His eyes, once so confident, darted frantically around the room, wide with disbelief and a dawning comprehension of his utter defeat. He looked at me, his gaze filled with a primal hatred, then at Erica, who had gone deathly pale. His chair scraped back abruptly. He tried to run. A desperate lunge for the door, a futile attempt to escape the inevitable. But the FBI was already at the park. Tony, ever the master of timing, had ensured their presence. As Paul burst out of the mediation room, intending to flee the courthouse, he was met by a phalanx of agents, their badges glinting, their voices firm. "Paul Matthews, you're under arrest." The words, stark and powerful, echoed through the quiet corridor. The dignity of my revenge wasn't in a loud public spectacle, but in the quiet, precise dismantling of his carefully constructed facade. He was caught not by my anger, but by his own hubris, by the intricate web of his own making, and by the relentless pursuit of truth. And Alyssa? While I was delivering the final blow, she was delivering her own, equally devastating, impact. She didn't just crack the spyware's encryption, she dissected its very architecture. Working tirelessly, fueled by a quiet rage and an astonishing intellect, she traced the code, followed its digital footprint, and linked it to 17 other cases, high-profile divorce proceedings where other spouses had been similarly targeted, their lives digitally compromised. She didn't just expose Paul's individual crime, she exposed the systemic corruption of Sterling and Vance. Her work was a beacon, shining light into the darkest corners of their digital malfeasance. And in a moment of unexpected, profound empathy, she reached out to Erica's sister, confirming the blackmail, providing the evidence needed to save her from the firm's insidious grip. The raw power of a quiet, dignified vengeance. It felt earned, not forced. It felt like justice. Paul was arrested. The news, when it broke, didn't just ripple through the legal community. It hit like a seismic shockwave. Prominent attorney arrested in digital espionage scandal. Sterling and Vance implicated in widespread blackmail scheme. The headlines screamed, adorned with Paul's mugshot, his once polished image shattered. His firm collapsed, not with a whimper, but with a sudden, spectacular implosion. Clients withdrew, partners resigned, and the carefully constructed empire of Sterling and Vance crumbled under the weight of its own corruption. The dominoes fell quickly, relentlessly. Erica, faced with overwhelming evidence and her own precarious situation, turned whistleblower. Her testimony provided crucial insider details, corroborating Alyssa's technical findings and Tony's investigative work. She, too, had been a victim in her own way, trapped in a moral quagmire, and her cooperation helped bring down the entire criminal enterprise. The scandal rocked the legal community, forcing a painful reevaluation of ethical standards and digital security. It was a public reckoning, a stark reminder that even in the hallowed halls of justice, darkness could thrive. We lost the house. The sprawling, beautiful home that had once represented our dreams, now tainted by betrayal, was part of the legal proceedings, part of the assets frozen and seized. It was a tangible loss, a physical severing from the past. But as the movers packed up our lives, piece by painful piece, a strange sense of liberation settled over me. The house was just a house. It was a gilded cage, a monument to a lie. What we found, in the ashes of that life, was our peace. A quiet, profound peace that settled deep in our bones. We moved into a smaller apartment, cozier, simpler, but filled with a new kind of light, the light of truth, of resilience, of an unbreakable bond forged in fire. Alyssa was accepted into a cybersecurity program at her dream university, a full scholarship awarded not just for her academic brilliance, but for her extraordinary contribution to uncovering the Sterling and Vance scandal. She was hailed as a young pioneer, a digital detective. Watching her pack her bags, her face alight with excitement and purpose, filled me with an indescribable pride. She wasn't just surviving, she was thriving, channeling her trauma into a powerful force for good. Her future, once threatened by her father's greed, was now boundless, illuminated by her own incredible talent. I started teaching again, not at the same school, but at a community college, and this time with a deeper purpose. I developed a new course, Digital Wellness and Protection for the Modern Woman. I taught about online safety, about recognizing the subtle signs of digital abuse, about safeguarding privacy. My own story, once a source of shame and pain, became a powerful tool for empowerment. I shared my experiences, not to sensationalize, but to educate, to warn, to equip other women with the knowledge to recognize the insidious nature of digital control before it buried them. I saw the relief, the recognition, the quiet understanding in their eyes. It was more than just a job, it was a mission, a way to transmute my pain into purpose. The last message I got from a burner email, presumably from one of Paul's former colleagues who had escaped prosecution, read, "You think you've won. But power protects its own." It was a chilling reminder, a final whisper from the shadows of the world we had escaped. I read it, paused, and then, with a calm click of the delete button, I erased it. It held no power over me anymore. Their brand of power, rooted in control and fear, was a hollow, fragile thing. Real power? It's not about controlling others. It's not about surveillance or manipulation or public humiliation. It's about truth. It's about resilience. It's about protecting those you love, fiercely and unconditionally. And together, my daughter and I, two women forged in fire, rebuilt a life no spyware could touch, a life built on honesty, on strength, on an unshakable bond that no betrayal could ever break. Resolution came not as a sudden, dramatic declaration, but as a quiet, steady unfolding. It wasn't about forgiveness, not in the traditional sense, and certainly not for Paul. It was about release. It was about disentanglement. The physical distance from the old life, the emotional distance from the pain, it all contributed to a profound sense of closure. I was free, not because I forgot, but because I outgrew the pain. The betrayal, once a gaping wound, had slowly, painstakingly, scarred over. It was a part of my story, a defining chapter, but it no longer defined me. There was no bitterness. That was the surprising part. The rage had burned itself out, replaced by a quiet strength. The desire for retribution, once a cold ember, had faded, replaced by a deep satisfaction in justice served and a life reclaimed. I didn't spend my days wishing Paul ill. He was simply a distant, irrelevant figure, a cautionary tale. His downfall wasn't my victory, my rebuilding was. I found joy in the small things again. The scent of freshly brewed coffee in the morning, the warmth of the sun on my face, the easy laughter with Alyssa over dinner. These were the moments that mattered, the true fabric of a life well lived. The quiet hum of my new life was a testament to resilience, a symphony of small triumphs. My past wasn't erased, it was integrated. It had taught me invaluable lessons about trust, about discernment, about the hidden strength that lies within us when everything else is stripped away. I learned to trust again, cautiously, thoughtfully. My circle of friends became smaller, but infinitely more genuine. Sarah, my best friend, had been a pillar of support, her unwavering belief in me a lifeline. Tony Stark became a trusted advisor, a friend. I learned that true connections aren't built on shared illusions, but on shared values, on authenticity, on mutual respect. The woman who had found the spyware on her phone at 2:45 a.m. was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, clearer, more grounded. Someone who understood the insidious nature of control, but also the liberating power of reclaiming oneself. There was no drama, no grand pronouncements. Just a quiet, dignified strength that emanated from deep within. I had found my way back, not to the old life, but to a better one. A life defined not by what was taken from me, but by what I rebuilt. A life where true power wasn't about dominance, but about dignity. Have you found your way back from betrayal?